You ever watch something collapse before anyone else realizes it's already over? The smell hit me first. Thick, wet mud and algae rising into the morning air like the lake itself was breathing out for the last time. And I knew exactly what that meant before I even checked the gauge. The waterline had already dropped 6 inches in under 3 minutes. And out across the surface, that floating restaurant sat there shining like $1 million lie. White decking, glass railings, banners snapping in the wind that read grand opening 10 a.m. And people were already gathering on the dock in pressed shirts and summer dresses, holding coffee, laughing like they weren't standing on something that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Because that lake wasn't theirs. It never was. It was mine. 42 acres of controlled water system my father engineered back in 1983, and every inch of it tied to a dam that most people thought was just scenery. Just a quiet hill with a rusted gate, and a warning sign nobody read anymore. But I read it every day growing up, every bolt, every valve, every inch of reinforced concrete. Because my dad didn't just build a lake, he built control, and he taught me that control doesn't shout. It waits, and it acts when it matters. And standing there that morning with the metal lever cold in my hand, I could hear the low groans starting to carry across the water, subtle at first, like wood adjusting under weight. But I knew that sound. I'd heard it during drought tests years ago when we had to release pressure to keep the system stable. And out there Victoria Hale was walking the deck like she owned the horizon. White blazer, sunglasses, greeting guests like she had built something permanent, like she had permission, like she hadn't ignored every certified letter, every survey map, every legal notice I sent proving that lake wasn't part of her HOA's community vision. And the thing about people like Victoria is they don't think systems apply to them. They think paperwork is optional. That land just becomes theirs if they dress it up nice enough. And I remember the first day I saw the construction crews, steel posts driven straight into the water, diesel fumes hanging in the air, the surface rippling in a way it never had before, like the lake itself was disturbed. And I asked the foreman who signed off on it. And he just pointed toward the neighborhood and said HOA approval like that meant anything to the ground beneath his feet. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was theft dressed up as progress. And I tried to stop it the right way. I really did. Lawyers, county records. Even a meeting where Victoria smiled at me like I was a nuisance and said the community needed this upgrade, needed a centerpiece, needed something that increased value. And I remember looking past her shoulder at the water behind her and thinking, you don't understand what that is. You think it's a backdrop, but it's a system, and systems don't care about your plans. And now standing here as the sunlight hit that perfect reflection one last time, I eased the lever down another inch and watched the surface begin to sink just enough that the dock creaked, and one of the workers paused, looking out, confused, and I could feel it in my chest, that quiet shift from waiting to inevitable. Because what they built out there wasn't just unauthorized. It was impossible without me letting it exist, and they had no idea I had just stopped letting it. The first shout did not come from the guests. It came from one of the contractors standing knee-deep near the edge, staring at the exposed posts like he had just realized something was wrong with the math. And that is when the chatter on the deck started to shift, voices lowering, footsteps pausing, glasses hovering midair as people began to notice the subtle tilt beneath them. Not enough to panic yet, just enough to make instinct whisper that something was off. And I watched Victoria turn. Slowly, her smile tightening for half a second before she forced it back into place, clapping her hands and calling it normal, settling like she could talk physics into obedience. But the lake does not negotiate, and the surface kept dropping, inch by inch, revealing dark streaks along the support beams that had been hidden just minutes before, and I could hear the faint suction sound of water pulling away from the shoreline, a deep, steady draw that vibrated through the ground beneath my boots. And that sound took me back 20 years to when my father first showed me the control room inside the dam. The air cool and damp, the smell of metal and mineral water thick in the space as he rested his hand on this same lever and said, "This is not just water, son. This is pressure, and pressure always finds balance." And back then I did not understand what he meant, not fully, but I understood the weight in his voice, the kind that comes from building something that outlasts you. And now standing here with the mechanism humming beneath my palm, I finally understood every word, because out there they had added weight where it did not belong, thousands of pounds of decking, steel, and people, all resting on a system calibrated decades ago for something entirely different. And I had tried to explain that, calmly, professionally, with diagrams and permits and data that showed exactly how the lake levels were regulated through a controlled release channel that fed into a downstream irrigation line. But Victoria had leaned back in her chair that day, tapping her pen against my paperwork like it was a suggestion instead of a fact, and she said the community voted. Ethan, this is happening. And I remember the way the fluorescent lights reflected off the polished table as I looked at her and realized she thought ownership was a popularity contest, that if enough people agreed with her, then reality would adjust itself to match. And that was the moment I stopped trying to convince her and started preparing, because systems do not care about votes. They respond to inputs, and I knew exactly which input would bring everything back to equilibrium. So I went back to the records, pulled the original engineering permits, verified the release capacity, checked the downstream flow limits to make sure everything stayed within legal thresholds, every step documented, every variable accounted for, because this was never about chaos, it was about correction. And now as the exposed lakebed began to show through in patches, thick, dark mud glistening under the morning sun, I could see the realization starting to spread across the crowd like a slow wave. Heads turning, phones coming out, voices rising just enough to break through the music still playing softly from the speakers. And Victoria was no longer smiling. She was scanning, searching for someone to blame, someone to control, but there was nothing out there she could command, nothing she could find or threaten into compliance. Because the only thing that mattered in that moment was the system she chose to ignore, and I was the one who understood it. By the time the water dropped another foot, the music cut out on its own like the speakers could feel the shift, and that silence hit harder than anything else, because now all you could hear was the structure reacting, slow creaks rolling across the platform, metal joints adjusting, the low suction of water pulling away from the supports, and people started stepping back instinctively, not running, just recalibrating. The way you do when something familiar suddenly is not. And I saw one of the servers glance down at the deck beneath her feet, then out toward the shoreline that was no longer where it had been 10 minutes ago. And that is when the first real question cut through the air, someone asking why the water was moving, not rising, not splashing, but leaving. And Victoria turned toward the dock, scanning the faces like she expected an answer to present itself. But there was nothing out there except the reality she had ignored for months, and I could feel the vibration through. The dam increased slightly as the release channel continued to do exactly what it was designed to do. Controlled flow, steady output, no sudden drop, no chaos. Just an inevitable correction happening at a pace that gave everyone enough time to understand what was happening. And that was important to me, because this was never about shock, it was about clarity. And I remembered the night I stood in my garage with the original blueprints spread across the workbench, tracing the flow lines with my finger, calculating exactly how long it would take to lower the lake by 2 feet without exceeding downstream limits, checking rainfall data, soil absorption rates, every variable accounted for, because the law is very clear about water management, and I was not about to give her anything she could twist into a narrative against me. And out there the floating restaurant was no longer floating the way it was supposed to. One side sitting just slightly lower, enough that the alignment of the railings looked off if you knew what you were seeing, and I saw one of the contractors step onto the dock, shake his head, and say something to Victoria that wiped the last bit of composure off her face, and she started walking faster now, heels sharp against the decking, moving toward the gangway like she could reach the problem and fix it with authority alone. But authority does not change elevation, and I could see it in her posture, the shift from confidence to calculation, because now she was trying to understand what she was dealing with. And that is when she finally looked up toward the dam. Not directly at me at first, just in that direction, like something in her mind was connecting pieces she had dismissed before, and I did not move. I just stood there with the lever steady in my grip, watching the system continue to rebalance itself, because everything happening out there had already been decided the moment she chose to build on something she did not control, and the lake kept dropping, steady, measured, undeniable, and the truth was finally visible in a way no document or warning could ever make it. Victoria stopped halfway down the gangway when her heel hit the slight angle that should not have been there, and I saw it register in real time. That precise moment when confidence cracks and gets replaced by something colder, something calculating, and she turned back toward the platform, scanning the structure like she could force it to behave if she just looked hard enough. But the geometry was already wrong. The lines no longer parallel. The reflection broken where smooth water used to carry it perfectly, and people were stepping off now, slower, careful, the kind of movement that says nobody wants to be the first to say something is wrong, but everyone feels it. And the shoreline kept pulling away, exposing patches of dark lakebed that had not seen sunlight in decades, thick mud stretching out in uneven shapes that made the entire scene look unfinished, like a set piece pulled apart mid-performance. And I could hear voices rising, not panicked, but sharp, asking questions, pointing at the supports, at the angle, at the waterline that was now visibly lower than the markings on the dock posts. And one man in a suit crouched down, touched the surface, then looked at his fingers like he expected a different answer. And that was when Victoria finally looked straight at the dam. And saw me. Really saw me this time. Not as a nuisance, not as paperwork, but as the variable she never accounted for. And even from that distance I could read it in her posture, the way her shoulders squared, the way her head tilted just slightly, as if she was trying to place me into a category she could control. But there was nothing in her system for this. Nothing in her bylaws or meetings or votes that could override what was happening. And I remembered the last letter I sent her, certified, signed, with copies of every permit and every survey attached. The one where I explained in plain language that any alteration to the lake structure without coordination with the control system could result in instability. And she had sent it back through her attorney with a single line that said the association had full authority over community enhancements. And I had stood there in my kitchen reading that line twice, feeling the quiet certainty settle in that she was not misunderstanding, she was choosing to ignore, and that choice has consequences. Always, not loud, not immediate, but inevitable. And now those consequences were visible in every inch the water receded, in every creak of that platform adjusting to a reality it was never designed for. And I eased the lever just a fraction more, feeling the resistance shift as the mechanism continued its controlled release, steady and legal and documented. And out there Victoria took a step forward onto the dock, stopped, then turned sharply and started speaking to the contractors, her hands moving faster now, pointing, directing, trying to reassert control over something that did not recognize her authority. And one of the workers shook his head, stepped back, and that small gesture said more than anything else could, because it was the moment she realized this was not a fixable problem. Not today. Not in front of cameras and guests and everything she had built her image around. And the lake kept lowering, calm and precise, like it had been waiting for this correction all along. And I stood there knowing this was the part she could not undo, because the system was never hers to begin with. The platform had stopped pretending to float by the time the water dropped another 6 inches, and now it sat there uneven, one side visibly lower. The clean lines of its design warped into something awkward and exposed, and you could see it in the way people moved, careful steps, eyes constantly flicking downward, conversations cutting off mid-sentence as reality finally caught up to the illusion. And I watched one of the event planners try to keep things together, gesturing toward the bar, forcing a smile, telling guests it was a minor issue, just a temporary adjustment. But even her voice carried that thin edge of doubt, because nothing about this looked temporary anymore, and the shoreline had pulled back far enough that patches of thick, dark mud now stretched between the dock and the water, breaking the reflection that used to make the whole scene look seamless. And I could hear the faint squelch as one of the crew stepped too close to the edge and tested the ground, then immediately stepped back, shaking his head, and that small moment spread faster than any announcement could, because people trust what they see, and what they were seeing did not match the picture they had been sold. And Victoria was moving faster now, phone pressed to her ear, pacing the dock in sharp, controlled strides, her voice low but urgent, trying to pull control from somewhere, anywhere. But every second the lake kept lowering made that harder, because control requires leverage, and she had none here, not over water, not over gravity, not over a system she never bothered to understand. And I remembered the inspection report I sent too. Weeks before this, the one with highlighted sections explaining the load distribution limits for any structure placed on the lake, the calculations showing exactly how even a slight drop in water level would shift stress across the support points. And I had written it clearly, no jargon, no ambiguity, just facts. Because I thought maybe if she saw the numbers she would pause, reconsider, but she did not. She pushed forward, scheduled the launch, invited press, turned it into a statement, and now that statement was unraveling in front of everyone who mattered to her. And the sound of the structure carried farther now, a low, constant strain that you could feel more than hear, like the lake itself was reminding everyone that it had rules, and those rules were not optional. And I eased my grip slightly, not releasing more, just holding it steady, letting the system continue its controlled balance, because this was the exact point I had calculated, the threshold where the difference would be undeniable, but still safe, still within every regulation, every permit, every line of law that protected what was mine. And out there one of the guests finally said it out loud, asked if the lake was draining, and that question cut through everything else, because once it is said, it cannot be unsaid. And I saw Victoria stop mid-step, her shoulders tightening as she realized the narrative had slipped out of her hands, and she looked back toward the water again, then toward me. And this time there was no confusion left, just the clear understanding that whatever was happening, it was not something she could stop, and the lake kept moving, steady and indifferent, revealing more of what had always been there beneath the surface, and taking away everything she had built on top of it. The moment the question spread across the deck, everything shifted from confusion to awareness, and awareness is dangerous because it strips away denial. And I could see it happening in real time as more guests stepped off the platform onto the dock, not in a rush, but with that quiet urgency people have when they no longer trust what they are standing on, and the weight distribution changed instantly. The structure lifting slightly on one side as bodies moved, then settling again with a low groan that carried across the thinning water, and Victoria raised her voice now, trying to regain control, saying it was a temporary maintenance adjustment, something scheduled, something normal, but even she did not sound convinced anymore. And I watched one of the contractors walk past her without stopping, heading straight toward the shoreline with a measuring stick, dipping it into what was left of the water near the edge, then pulling it out and shaking his head, and that small, silent report told her everything she needed to know. This was not a glitch. This was a controlled release, and that meant someone had the authority to do it. And her eyes snapped back to the dam again, locking onto me with a clarity that had been missing before, because now she understood the one thing she had refused to accept. This lake had an owner, and he was not standing on her side of the shore. And I could almost trace the path of realization through her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her stance narrowed, like she was bracing against something she could not see but finally believed. And I remembered the county clerk's office 3 months ago, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I pulled the original deed from the archives, yellowed paper, stamped and recorded long before any of those houses were built, long before any HOA existed, and I ran my finger across the line that mattered most, water rights and control authority retained by property owner. And I made copies, certified them, sent them with every notice, every warning, every chance for her to step back before this became public, because I did not want a spectacle. I wanted compliance. But she chose spectacle. She chose a grand opening. She chose cameras and invitations and the kind of attention that turns a private mistake into a public lesson. And now that lesson was unfolding inch by inch as the lake continued to lower, exposing more of the uneven ground beneath, patches of old stone, remnants of the original creek bed that fed into this system decades ago, details nobody had seen in years, and those details made it impossible to pretend nothing was happening. And I felt the mechanism settle into a steady rhythm beneath my hand, the controlled flow reaching the exact rate I had calculated, balanced, legal, documented, and I held it there, not pushing further, not accelerating, because this was the point where the message was clear without crossing any line. And out there Victoria lowered her phone slowly, no longer speaking, just staring across the distance between us. And in that silence I could see the shift complete, from someone who believed she could take control of anything she touched to someone who had just realized she had built everything on something she never owned. And the lake kept receding, steady and certain, and for the first time since this started, there was nothing left for her to say. By now the lake had dropped enough that the illusion was completely gone. No reflection, no seamless surface, just exposed reality stretching outward in uneven patches of dark mud and shallow water. And the platform sat there no longer pretending to belong. Its supports visible, angles wrong, the clean design reduced to something temporary and out of place. And the crowd had thinned to clusters along the dock, people standing back, phones raised, recording, because once something breaks in public, it becomes evidence, and I could see the shift in their faces, not panic, not fear, but that quiet recalibration when people realize they have been standing inside someone else's mistake. And Victoria was no longer pacing. She had stopped completely, shoulders squared toward the dam, eyes locked on me with a focus that finally matched the situation. And even from that distance I could tell she was putting the pieces together, not just what was happening, but why. And I remembered the last conversation we had in person, standing by the shoreline while construction was still underway, the smell of diesel in the air, the rhythmic thud of machinery driving supports into water that had never been meant to hold them. And I told her clearly, this system is not passive. It responds. And she smiled like she had heard something amusing. Said the association had already invested too much to turn back, that progress required confidence. And I remember looking past her at the water, calm at the time, reflecting everything perfectly, and thinking confidence does not change physics. And now that truth was sitting out there for everyone to see, inch by inch, as the lake continued its steady withdrawal, and the contractors had stopped trying to adjust anything. Tools lowered, conversations quiet, because there is a point where effort becomes pointless, where you recognize that what you built does not match the conditions it depends on. And one of them stepped back from the structure entirely, hands on his hips, just watching, and that stillness carried more weight than any argument ever could. And I held the lever exactly where it needed to be, not pushing further, just maintaining the balance I had calculated, because this was never about draining everything. It was about revealing enough to make the truth undeniable, enough to show that what stood out there was never supported the way they believed. And I could feel the system humming beneath me, steady, controlled, doing exactly what it was designed to do decades ago. And I thought about my father again, the way he used to check every gauge twice, the way he would say you do not fight a system, you understand it, and once you understand it, you decide when it moves. And out there Victoria took a single step forward on the dock, then stopped, like she was about to say something, about to call out. But the words never came, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to negotiate, and the distance between us held everything that mattered, control on one side, consequence on the other, and the lake kept receding, quiet and certain, exposing more of the truth with every passing second, until there was no version of this where she could pretend it was hers anymore. The cameras were everywhere now, small black rectangles held up like witnesses, capturing every inch the water pulled away, every shift in the structure that had once looked flawless from a distance. And I could hear the low murmur of voices turning into something sharper, questions stacking on top of each other, not directed at me yet, but moving in that direction, because people always look for the source once they understand the effect. And the platform had settled into its new reality. No longer drifting, no longer balanced, just sitting uneven against a surface that refused to support it the way it had an hour ago. And the exposed lakebed stretched wider now, cracked in places, smooth in others, a patchwork of textures that made it impossible to ignore how much had changed in such a short time. And I watched as one of the reporters stepped closer to the edge, angling their camera to capture the gap between the structure and the receding water, narrating quietly, turning what had been a celebration into a story. And that was the moment the situation shifted from private conflict to public record, because once it is documented, it cannot be rewritten, and Victoria knew that. I could see it in the way she straightened her posture, the way she adjusted her expression, trying to regain control not of the lake, but of the narrative, because that is where people like her operate, in perception, in presentation, but perception needs something solid to stand on, and right now she had nothing. And I thought about the legal folder sitting in my truck, copies of every notice, every survey, every permit stamped and dated, ready for the moment this crossed from ignored warning into undeniable consequence. Because this was not just about water levels anymore, this was about accountability, about proving that what happened here was not accidental, not unpredictable, but the direct result of choices made in full awareness of the facts. And I felt the steady hum beneath my feet continue, the system holding its pace, controlled and consistent, exactly where I needed it to be, and I did not touch the lever, not yet, because the point had not fully landed. Not until everyone understood what they were looking at, and out there Victoria finally took a step forward toward the end of the dock, then stopped again, like she was measuring the distance, not just physically, but in terms of control, and I could almost see the calculation happening, whether to call out, to confront, to pretend, but each option required a version of reality that no longer existed, and the lake kept revealing more, pulling back another few inches. Enough that the edge of the platform now hovered clearly above the water on one side, breaking the illusion completely, and a quiet realization settled over the entire scene. Not dramatic, not loud, just certain that everything built out there depended on something they never owned. And now that foundation was gone, and as I stood there watching it all unfold, I knew this was the moment that mattered most. Not the drop, not the reaction, but the understanding. Because once people see how something actually works, they never look at it the same way again. By the time the water settled into the level I had calculated, the entire scene had transformed from something polished into something exposed, and the difference was not just physical, it was understood, because nobody was looking at the structure anymore like it was an attraction. They were looking at it like a mistake, something that never should have been there in the first place. And the silence that followed carried more weight than any argument ever could, broken only by the occasional sound of a shoe shifting on the dock or the faint hum of cameras still recording, capturing every angle of a story that had already decided how it would be told. And I finally eased my hand off the lever completely, letting the system hold where it was, balanced, controlled, exactly within the limits I had mapped out, because this was as far as it needed to go, not destruction, not excess, just enough to make the truth undeniable and permanent. And out there Victoria stood still for a long moment, then slowly lowered her gaze from the dam back to the structure, taking in what remained, the uneven lines, the exposed supports, the waterline that no longer matched her plans, and I could see it settle in her posture, that final shift from resistance to recognition. Because there is a point where even the most determined person understands that they are no longer in control, and this was that point. And I thought about everything that had led here. Every warning, every document, every opportunity. She had to step back before this became public, before it became visible, and how each one had been dismissed with the same quiet confidence that rules did not apply if you believed strongly enough. And now that belief was standing on display for everyone to see, measured not in opinions or arguments, but in inches of water that were no longer there. And I turned slightly, glancing back at the control panel behind me. The gauge is steady, the flow rate exactly where it should be, every number confirming what I already knew, that this was not an accident, not a malfunction, but a correction carried out within every boundary of the law. And that mattered, because when the questions came, and they would, the answers would already be documented, already supported, already clear. And out on the dock people began to disperse, not in a rush, just a quiet understanding that whatever had been planned for that morning was no longer happening. And one of the reporters turned their camera toward the dam, holding it there for a second longer than before, like they had finally found the center of the story. And I met that lens without moving, because there was nothing to hide, nothing to explain beyond what was already visible. And the lake remained where I had set it, calm, controlled, no longer pretending to support something it never agreed to carry. And as the last of the noise faded into the distance, I looked back out over the exposed shoreline and the structure that no longer belonged there, and the thought settled in quietly, the same one my father used to repeat without raising his voice. That control is not about taking something from someone else. It is about knowing what is yours and refusing to let anyone else decide how it is used. And out there, finally, that truth was all that remained.